The world according to Jen and Carolyn.
What's up, Jen?
All right, so I don't know what's up. I'm getting over a cold. I sound like death. I'm going to try not to obnoxiously sniff and cough throughout this episode, but just a warning. You might get some of that action.
That's all right. I have a runny nose.
That's disgusting.
I still feel very congested. It's fall.
I used to love fall and winter until I had a child who brings home every disease under the sun.
Well, and all the smoke doesn't help, too. There's some environmental things happening.
Yes,
so,
yes, it's like a shit storm of, I don't know, like physiological fuck-ups. Like,
yes.
It's bad, but, you know.
We're feeling it.
We're feeling it. Yesterday we were at a kid's party, and the boys, my kid's 6, they are so grabby, and at one point they're like open air coughing on each other, and my husband's like, boys, why are you open air coughing? And I look at my husband and just like put their arm over their mouth just to demonstrate they know how to do it, but clearly they weren't doing it.
Adults do that too, please.
Oh God, I know, it's
I'm
so
just
gross.
gonna start wearing a mask again.
But yeah, there's no doubt in our minds how our kids all end up with the same viruses. We've witnessed it firsthand. The spread. It's like that outbreak scene where you just see it moving from the theater. Yeah, pretty much.
Speaking of public health,
yeah, we're going to talk about addiction. And addiction is a public health crisis in this country. In our society and healthcare systems continue, by and large, to stigmatize those who are afflicted with this disease. And oftentimes those who are battling substance use disorder end up in the prison system, where they're treated like criminals worthy of punishment rather than sick people in need of treatment. So how did we get here? How can we address this crisis that costs our country approximately $740 billion annually in a way that actually helps people? So because there's so much to unpack here, as we say in grad school, this is going to have to be a 2-parter.
Yeah.
So this first part, we're really going to be talking about the war on drugs and the racist overtones associated with the war on drugs, how it's still impacting our society and the way we treat folks with substance use disorder, as well as talking about the opioid epidemic and how we got there and Big Pharma's role. It's a lot to cover, but we don't, obviously there's some personal responsibility that keys in here, and we'll talk about that. But there's also a lot of overarching pressures and structures.
Yes.
And we're only human. Yeah, inequity. We're only human. And we only know what's around us typically. And that's how we tend to fall victim to these things. So, we're going to talk about the racist crack epidemic. In this part, in the second part, we're going to talk about treatment options for those with alcohol and substance use disorder, and the high cost of these treatment programs and rehabs. And, as well as, I touched on this briefly, the lack of empathy and understanding that average folks and even our healthcare system has for those who are ensnared by addiction. Carolyn, so I know you have experience working with teens and adults and stuff in a treatment facility setting. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Jen, I got to add this first. In my academic training, this is in my master's level program, I got 1 semester of addiction.
Jeez.
And that was because I was in the spring cohort. It took place in the summer. So it was like 4, maybe 2-hour sessions.
Oh, wow.
And we basically watched Ken Burns' Addiction.
Oh, geez.
No offense to this teacher, and most things.
Or Ken Burns, because he does amazing work.
Oh, it was amazing. In grad school, you kind of have to know you're going to do a lot of the work on your own.
Yes.
But I remember my supervisor saying, hey, if you really want to understand how to be a good therapist, you need to work with teens and you need to work with addiction and recovery, because that's basically everyone you're going to see.
Interesting.
We're all kind of kids trying to figure stuff out, or people get stunted. And also, if you can understand addiction and recovery, you can understand a lot about change and about motivation and about excuses and about science and all that stuff. But, Congress does require all doctors to receive 8 hours of education on substance use disorders and prescribing controlled substances. But I think based off these two stories, we can see 8 hours is not enough for a doctor.
Yeah.
And 1 semester is not enough for a therapist. Now, given that if you want to go into addiction recovery work, you do have to do the other certifications. Yeah. You do have to do other training.
Yeah.
But I do think that anyone in the medical field, anyone in the human services field, needs a foundational education on substance abuse disorders. Not just legal, but illegal, starting in medical school and going through residency. But, this goes for anyone who's working in these programs. And it's basically up to the consumer now to ensure that the experts, so you might come to me and say, oh, she worked at a rehab. I could say that, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert.
Right.
I haven't taken the additional courses. So, I did, but you don't know that the other person did. But, again, it's this idea that the patient is no longer a patient. They're a consumer in the healing field. And, not only does that make a weird sort of
dynamic.
It's a weird dynamic, though, because, when we get a referral, we want to trust that the person we're going to has the clinical and ethical scope of practice and expertise. And I can say firsthand that, the state of a family member and an addict, they've got enough going on. Yeah. And so oftentimes the role of the therapist is helping you find the next, where is the best place to go? Right. And I think it's just unacceptable that we're expecting sick people to advocate while they're suffering. Bottom line.
Well, that's our entire medical system, unfortunately. And that's what happens. I think when you privatize things and when you make the cost of healthcare, unattainable and unsustainable for most folks, for everyday people. So, we say all this to say Carolyn has much more expertise than I do, but
I don't agree though. You've known I haven't known as many addicts personally.
Yeah.
And people who have suffered, you have known that.
I guess I have more personal experience with that for sure, but I'm by no means an expert. And I have worked adjacent to the field. Like I've worked with formerly homeless folks, most of whom were, had substance use disorder in conjunction with mental health. So I have that experience, but we're not experts. We are, for the most part, we're ordinary people who I think have more exposure than the average person. And we do see that something's wrong. And this is what we do on the show. We like to call out some of the biggest issues. We feel like we have a moral and an ethical obligation to do this with, our small but mighty platform. So we're going to be providing historical context. So Carolyn is going to start off with an overview of rehab treatment in the U.S. We just pulled out some of the more salient pieces of history, so forgive us if we omitted anything crucial. So Carolyn, kick us off. Tell us what's going on.
Well, you're always going to see Founding Father Benjamin Rush as the quintessential, where did alcoholism as a disease come from? Not just a matter of personal willpower, which I do believe in this. Alcoholism has always been viewed as a criminal offense. And, again, this comes from a very puritanical look of, if you just pray it away, right? Because we all know that works out really well. God damn it. And confining someone to an asylum were often utilized. Although I do think we've kind of turned that back the other way.
Yes.
Some AA and some of the ways we incarcerate people.
Yeah, but in 1864, New York had one.
We had one, absolutely. And that's 1864, New York State Inebriate Asylum, the first hospital intended to solely treat alcoholism as a mental health condition, was founded. More community groups and sober houses began appearing.
That's kind of progressive.
Yeah, I know, right? 1880s, Freud recommends that cocaine be used to treat alcoholism and morphine for addiction. They didn't know.
Oh, Freud, I love you.
I know, Johnson & Johnson was doing that shit too.
Cocaine for everything. It really does alleviate, at least temporarily, a problem.
Well, when morphine and cocaine weren't working, they said, hey, we found this new drug called heroin. It's really good to help you get off this. So, we didn't know. 1901, Charles B. Towns Hospital opens, treated affluent alcoholics with its famous belladonna elixir.
Oh, wow.
Isn't
that toxic?
It's a plant,
I just remember it from Practical Magic.
Yeah.
He kills motherfucker with belladonna.
Oh, I love that movie.
He was abusive. He needed to go.
He did.
And then he came back as a ghost. Anyway, that's my other show. Seen It with Bill and Jen, where we talk about movies. I'm not going to do that here. Go on.
Bill Wilson, founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, was was a patient of the town's hospital 4 times. At that time, the cost of treatment was $350 a day, which is a lot of money in 1901. Mm-hmm. That would be equivalent to $5,600 today. And when we do our next episode, I will tell you how much recovery actually costs. Yeah. 1910, the passage of state laws that call for sterilization of the mentally ill. Awesome. Wow. Although that was going on for women of color and men of color long before that, and Native populations, developmentally disabled, alcoholics, addicts. They just said, let's just not let these people reproduce, right?
That's the solution.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So legalization was granted to medical supervisors of asylums and prisons the authority to asexualize a patient or inmate if such action would improve her physical, mental, or moral condition. Jesus Christ. 1935, Dr. Bob Smith and Bill Wilson, commonly known as Dr. Bob and Bill W., founded Alcoholics Anonymous, a spiritually based approach to rehab. AA is still extremely popular today. I have mixed feelings about it. We will definitely talk about that more in episode 2. Part 2, 1952, the AMA, that's the American Medical Association, defines alcoholism. This is where you start seeing this more science-based, which is good. Committee to agree to define it as a primary chronic disease with genetic, psychosocial, environmental factors. This is a huge progressive move here.
It's a big shift.
So glad that happened. 1960s, 1970s, insurance industry begins to reimburse treatment of alcoholism. That's also really important.
Yeah.
But then there's some other things that go on with that, in my opinion. Once you get insurance involved. 87, now we're getting into our time period. AMA calls drug addiction diseases, and the AMA passed legalization to identifying alcoholism as a complex disease that merited the serious concern of all health professionals. So this is when it really became more of a public health from a science standpoint, not a you're ruining our religion and our children.
Yeah,
you just
totally.
need to pray.
Just pray it away.
This I'm really interested in. The 2008, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equality Act. There's some new stuff actually coming out right now with this. The act required insurance companies and group health plans to provide similar benefits for mental health and substance use, as well as other types of medical care. Yes, that is absolutely good. So there's been a big push done since the 50s to really define alcohol and drug addiction as a disease, but not the way a lot of people see it, or at least as far as drugs go. So we see a complete reversion to criminalizing drug use, at least on a systemic level. And we failed the war on drugs. We're going to talk a lot about this. That's our
Thanks,
favorite
Reagan.
Thanks, Reagan.
I love an episode where we get to condemn Reagan. We should just do it no matter what we're talking about.
You never know.
Lighthearted topic? Let's shit on Reagan.
So anyway, I think, I'll go into a little bit before you talk about the war on drugs. I want to talk a little bit about how the brain and body work when it comes to addiction.
Yeah. Talk to us about, how addiction works and why we should be looking at this as a disease.
Yes. And again, I apologize for all the nose sniffing.
Yeah,
I'm ready to just stick a tissue up my nose, the way people do it.
Oh yeah, I've done that. And by the way, this whole ass house is a mess, you guys. Underneath our table in the pod cave is my dog who's wearing an Elizabethan cone. His poor thing got attacked by raccoons in our own backyard. Thank God she's got her rabies vaccine. Make sure you vaccinate your dogs for the love of God. And they clawed up her tail, and of course, as dogs do, she's been licking at it incessantly, and we're like, it's cone time. Time for the cone zone, bitch.
Cone
so she
shame.
looks real pathetic, and I'll certainly post a picture.
Oh, poor baby. I know. Yeah. She's getting to be kind of a staple in our show.
She really is.
I think she should be on all the YouTubes.
She really should. She is. She was licking away into the microphone when me and Bill were recording our last episode for our show.
Sound of licking.
It's gross. Anyway, we digress.
Addiction.
Yeah.
So addiction comes from the Latin word addicare.
Beautiful. Beautiful, bro. I don't know.
So anyway, this means enslaved or bound to. And if you think about what addiction is, you really are enslaved. And in my opinion, you can be addicted to anything.
Yeah.
There's use, there's abuse, and then there's addiction.
Yeah.
So as originally used, the word was not linked to substance use or behaviors, but instead it was associated with excessive alcohol use. So simply put, anything that you derive temporary pleasure from and relief from your thoughts, your emotions, your physical body, or reality is worth being an addiction. And you may joke that you're a shopaholic or a chocoholic, but chances are you just really like those things.
Ooh, crack mac and cheese. No, bitch, there's no crack in your mac and cheese.
Yeah,
Shut the fuck up.
Seriously, I hate that shit. So, to truly be as defined as an addiction, and I do want you to pay attention to this, it's got to be relief in short term, but here are the two things: negative long-term consequences and an inability to give up. So this is when people often might come to therapy and they're going to feel a little bit in denial about, oftentimes trying to get them to understand that something is an actual addiction.
Yeah.
My personal favorite addiction expert is a man named Dr. Gabor Mate. I have a lot of them, but I really like him. He calls for a compassionate approach toward addiction, whether in ourselves and definitely in others. Dr. Mate believes that the source of addictions is not to be found necessarily in genes, but in early childhood environment.
That makes a lot of sense.
And you think about this, there's always, if you have a family with 4 or 5 kids, not all of them are addicts.
Right.
So how a gene is in your body versus how your environment expresses it is always something that I think is in the mental health scope of practice to understand.
For sure.
Wonderful book. It's thick. The Realm of Hungry Ghosts. I just love that title. It's one of his best-selling books. It draws on cutting-edge science, real-life stories, and shows how addiction originates from trauma and emotional loss. So you can tell why I really like his work. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from Dr. Mate's work. Yeah. So he uses several several criteria in his definition. Firstly, craving the addictive substance or behavior, engaging in the addictive substance or behavior in order to experience pleasure or temporary relief from pain. And I'm sorry, but trauma is very painful. Yeah. If you disagree with that, you probably don't like our show very much.
Or you probably haven't experienced a significant amount of trauma or any trauma at all.
Yeah, or you've suppressed your trauma because you don't want to deal with it.
I mean, it's really simple, too, to be empathetic or empathic about this. It's like, have you lost somebody you love? Was that traumatic? Now imagine things of that nature or on that level happening to you consistently over and over and over again. Like, how would that impact your mental health?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you would think.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem hard to people like us, but we are empaths.
Yeah.
We can understand that.
Experience trauma.
So again, we got cravings, engaging, and then something called compulsion, which is an inability to give up the substance, chronicity, which is a relapse throughout the lifespan. We do not talk about relapse enough in the stages of healing. Yeah. And so addiction is an attempt to solve a problem, and it's actually a pretty good problem solver. It kind of works. It is the symptom of a deeper malaise, in most cases trauma. That's from directly from Gabor Mate. When bad things happened, or simply when good things should have happened, didn't, when a child didn't get their needs met or they were neglected, this can lead to addiction. Yeah. Or most people say, well, but why the addiction? Why the pain? In order to heal an addiction, we have to look at the underlying trauma. Again, this is where mental health comes in, or even just a really good friend or book. This is why it's key to find a healer or anything. I don't care what it is. Something that fits into your ideal of healing, to share this and hold you accountable outside of your family, because often our family members are usually the enablers. America loves to blame victims, though, Jen, and I know how frustrating it is to have someone with an addiction in your life, or for yourself to have an addiction, or for your family member. So we have to hold boundaries, which means, what are you going to do if this doesn't happen? You can't just keep giving directives like, well, you should stop, you should, but it's, I'm going to do this if you don't stop. And that's really hard. Yeah. And I also, without being called a conspiracy theorist, I don't trust that we are often protected from ourselves in the current and past models of medical and mental health.
I agree. And that's what the whole second part of this episode is going to be dedicated to. Okay, all that makes a ton of sense. And as I said, we're going to jump more into that later. So for now, we're going to talk about the war on drugs, which is really just a racist dog whistle created for the purpose of being able to more easily incarcerate low-income folks and or people of color. And the specter of this failed bullshit still haunts us. And many of the facets of it, many of the aspects of it are still in place in the way we police, for instance, in the way we incarcerate. And, this racist misleading tenets of the war on drugs undergird the ways we as society treat those afflicted with substance use disorder today. This laid the foundation for a lot of the mistakes we continue to make. So let's talk about the war on drugs. So we're going to start with the racist origins. So in 1870s, there were the opium laws that were created, and they were directed at Chinese immigrants. Then we have the early 1900s. We saw anti-cocaine laws directed at black men in the South. 1910 and 1920s, that's when anti-marijuana laws directed at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans were implemented. 1971, another big piece of shit, Richard Nixon declared the first war on drugs. And this is fact, you guys. This top Nixon aide, this has become a really popular comment that a lot of folks are now familiar with. His aide, John Ehrlichman, he later admitted, he said these were his words, "You want to know what this is really all about, this being the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black folks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Then we got the 1980s and 90s, Reagan. So out of the frying pan.
Fucking Reagan.
What's that?
I believe you wrote fucking
I did
Reagan.
write fucking Reagan. Yeah. So out of the frying pan into the fire here, the number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. Then in 1981-ish, we had Nancy Reagan, the Just Say No bullshit. Also, Police Chief Daryl Gates, who was the police chief, I believe, in L.A., I think he might have been the police chief during the Rodney King uprising. He believed that casual drug users should be taken out and shot. He founded the DARE program. Yeah, just like Trump. Founded the DARE drug education program, which was quickly adopted nationwide despite the lack of evidence of its effectiveness. And we all know now it does not work. The 90s, unfortunately, Clinton didn't do much better. He rejected a U.S. Sentencing Commission recommendation to limit the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences. You know the difference between crack and coke? I believe it's water. If I'm not, there's a great book by, I think his name is Dr. Carl Hart. He wrote a book called High Price, and he talks about that distinction. We'll talk more about that. Then you got George W., just ew. Rapid escalation of militarization of domestic drug law enforcement. Obama, despite supporting several successful policy changes, such as reducing the crack/powder sentencing disparity, ending the ban on federal funding for syringe access programs, and ending federal interference with state medical marijuana laws, did not shift the majority of drug policy funding to a health-based approach. There's just too much money invested in the prison industrial complex to really make a significant shift. It's bigger than any president.
And these are all not public health initiatives.
Yeah.
These are incarceration initiatives.
Yeah, totally.
Totally downstream.
Yeah. And then Trump called for harsher sentences for drug law violations and the death penalty, as I mentioned, just like Duarte, the president or former president of the Philippines, for people who sell drugs. He also resurrected disproven Just Say No messaging aimed at youth. Yeah, you're so hip, Trump. We're going to listen to you. Biden, we'll see. We are off to a decent start. The U.S. Justice Department has moved to ending the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine offenses, ending a policy widely seen as racist. Biden, he has admitted, hey, what I did in the 90s around prison stuff and sentencing, was really wrong. Yeah. Racist, but still, just because you admit that what you were complicit as a senator was wrong, you can't undo all the harm that it caused.
And do better now.
Which he and his administration are trying to do. So let's talk about sentencing disparities. About the hypocrisy that is the war on drugs, especially in the 80s. Nothing underscores just how racist the war on drugs was than the crack epidemic and the sentencing disparities between crack and coke that followed. So I've mentioned sentencing disparities numerous times in my timeline. What are we talking about here? So So there was a crack explosion in the inner cities in the 1980s, which may or may not have been due to the CIA. I don't know. Do your own research. I know I have. I don't have the time to get into this, but check out Gary Webb's pieces for the San Jose Mercury News about the CIA bringing crack into the U.S. to help fund an illegal war against the Marxist government in Nicaragua. Check it out, bro. 1986, Reagan again. Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The law created 100-to-1 quantity ratio between the amount of crack and powder cocaine needed to trigger certain mandatory minimum sentences for trafficking, as well as creating a mandatory minimum penalty for simple possession of crack cocaine.
I didn't know that.
And again, I believe the chemical difference between these two substances is water. But you've got one that appeals to low-income users and one that appeals to high-income users. And actually, this is another thing, and I think as I get through this, I wrote this a while ago. It's right here. This is my next point. Here's where the racism comes in. Approximately 2/3 of crack users are white or Hispanic or Latino. Yet the vast majority of persons convicted of possession in federal courts in 1994 were African American. Okay, so you can see that, the media was also complicit in this too.
Yes.
So media and law enforcement really perpetuated the myth that crack was an inner city and primarily a problem impacting the Black community. But how the narrative shifted when the focus became the opioid epidemic, which primarily impacts white people.
Yep.
So let's talk about the opioid crisis after I take a sip of coffee.
Well, and if you have not seen Painkiller on Netflix, I hope I say her name correctly, Uzo Aduba plays Edie Flowers. She deserves an award for this role. This is a phenomenal film.
I'm going to check it out.
It's going to make you really angry.
Yeah, I know.
But they show what you're about to talk about.
Good,
beautifully.
Because it's all relevant.
Yes.
And we would not be in these situations past, present, and inevitably future without these things fueling what we're seeing today. So the opioid crisis. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, public policy also shifted. 3/4 of the $7.4 billion Congress allotted in 2018 to fight the opioid epidemic went to research, treatment, and prevention rather than police and prisons. But racial disparities persist. When the articles mentioned Black and Latino opioid users, it was a crime report. Their criminal history, their court appearances were described. Their personal history was not. They're dehumanized. There was not a humanizing biography of the people in the story. And we all know, because it's frequently front page news when it comes to white people and white communities impacted by the opioid epidemic, it is definitely shown through a more empathetic lens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they're in pain.
Yeah, they're in pain. Oh, it's so clear. It's clear as day. Yeah. But maybe not to everybody. But to us, we're so woke, as the right would say. It's pretty evident. All you have to do is follow history, follow money.
Literally, yeah.
Speaking of money, now we're going to talk about Big Pharma and Big Pharma's role in all of this, or specifically the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, you can't talk about that without talking about Purdue.
You can't. You really can't. And I think it's important to lay the blame for this crisis at the feet of Big Pharma, Purdue specifically, who in 2020 pleaded guilty in federal court in Newark, New Jersey, to conspiracies to defraud the United States and violate the anti-kickback statute. But let's start from the beginning with these soulless assholes.
And we're talking about the Sackler family here.
We are talking about the Sacklers, yeah.
If you're not familiar, look up the Sacklers. They have a pretty interesting history in the world of mental health as well, and pharmaceuticals. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think they've gotten away with a lot of bullshit. Time and time again.
Weird, rich white people?
Yeah, tend to do.
Interesting.
So,
that's so strange, Jen.
It's a common refrain, a common theme in our society.
I'm so sick of that, though.
I know, I think we all are. So the info except for the people who benefit, of course.
Yeah, that's true.
They're not listening to the show.
No, they're not.
So the info in the timeline I'm going to go over comes from unsealed Purdue documents. This isn't Jen's opinion. This isn't Carolyn's opinion. These are actual Purdue documents. So 1993 to 1994, Purdue conducted a clinical trial in elderly patients with osteoarthritis to test the safety and efficacy of OxyContin. It enrolled 133 patients, but only 63 completed the trial. About 82% of the patients had some sort of adverse event related to the treatment. Then we got to December of 1994.
And you got to look up what those adverse events were.
Oh my
It was fucking chaotic.
Do they go through it in the movie? Oh, yeah. Okay. Then definitely check out this movie, you guys. December 1994, sales and marketing executive Michael Friedman, who would later become Purdue's CEO, sent a memo. Our current MS Cotton business has created a franchise with certain physicians who routinely write prescriptions for the drug. Great. And that's where the kickbacks come in.
Yeah.
October 1996, in another email exchange with executives, here's Richard Sackler, shows his attention to detail. In this case, about whether dinner programs Purdue hosts for doctors are cost-effective in driving an increase in attendees prescribing Oxy. Physicians who attended the dinner programs or the weekend meetings wrote more than double the number of new prescriptions for Oxy compared to the control group. They were being wined and dined.
Well, and I remember, so my dad actually had a narcotics license. He worked in workman's comp.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying he was always being invited to all these dinners and he wouldn't go.
Yeah.
He had a huge ethical problem with being solicited by drug companies.
Yeah.
And no one tells me what I prescribe or what I do.
Yep.
And I remember him and my mom talking about a lot of these drugs.
Wow.
And Oxy in specific, because he was constantly, and he had an office downtown at this time. He didn't anymore. He was working for another something called Concentra for workman's comp, but same thing where you were constantly getting the drug wraps. And in Painkiller, they really show how not only did they manipulate doctors, they manipulated patients,
right? They
manipulated young people to be their pimps of this drug.
They're ambassadors. And that's why so often I don't think I'm generalizing. The people who are out there as pharmaceutical reps, usually attractive.
Well, and I did sales for a senior service agency, and it was no secret that me and my counterpart were attractive, and we'd go in and we'd schmooze.
Yeah.
Now we were selling senior services,
but still, sales is sales.
Sales is sales, and so it's just. It is, but it was so, this was not accidental. It was so planned and just it gives you the creeps when you watch the show.
Well, all of this is based in psychology and manipulation and tactics that work.
Money.
Yeah. It's insidious, but also very, very plain to see, especially when you see all this documentation that's come out in regard to Purdue. So, in January of 1999, sales representatives were actually told that their bonuses would be calculated in a way that makes the incentive for selling Oxy much greater than selling MS Cotton. I guess that's something different.
MS Cotton was originally a cancer drug.
Oh, right.
And it wasn't doing well. And when the Sackler family, basically when one of the uncles passed away, they were like, we're going bankrupt, but we do have this one drug, MS Cotton, but it doesn't sell very well because it's for cancer.
I see.
And so they're like, well, let's sell freedom from pain.
Yeah. Let's rebrand it.
They rebranded.
Yeah, but it's some strong shit.
Yeah.
And I can see how somebody who's suffering with pain from cancer would actually need this.
No one, unless they have cancer, needs OxyContin.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I hate taking it because even when I've gone through, surgeries and a C-section.
I don't take it.
I took it, but I hated it. I hated the effects.
Yeah.
I hated the side effects. I hated being constipated.
Yeah.
My skin itched.
Yeah.
Like, it was awful.
Yeah.
Awful. And I wanted to get off it as quickly as possible. But it did mitigate my pain.
Yes.
It did. It was helpful. I tried Motrin, like 800 milligram Motrin or whatever, was insufficient for the pain experienced by somebody who had gone through hardcore surgery, which a C-section is. So anyway, more physicians started expressing concern about addiction, and there was more dismissal by Purdue and more of a push to prescribe. So in fall 2000, Kentucky starts to experience an epidemic. And in 2006, our favorite lawyer scumbag and former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, was lead counsel and lead spokesperson for Purdue Pharma during their negotiations with federal prosecutors over charges that Purdue had misled the public about Oxy's addictive properties. Purdue was a client of the firm Bracewell and Giuliani. The agreement reached results resulted in some of Purdue executives paying fines amounted to $634.5 million. This was in 2006. Let's look at April 2013. Documents for the Commonwealth of Kentucky's lawsuit against Purdue shows that Purdue had 78 sales reps assigned to Kentucky alone who promoted Oxy in some form through 2010. 40 states now have subsequently sued Purdue and the Sacklers for deceptive marketing practices and the subsequent addiction and deaths that followed. Then we get to December of 2020. The U.S. Department of Justice sued Walmart, accusing its pharmacies of not adequately screening painkiller prescriptions and thereby fueling the opioid epidemic. Surprise, another shady family, the Waltons, who actively union bust and underpay their employees and try to deprive them of benefits. We got to do a show on Walmart.
Yeah, we do.
I know. My selective outrage is showing. No Starbucks either. All right, so February of 2021, consultancy McKinsey and Company agreed to pay $573 million to 47 state governments to settle claims it advised Purdue Pharma and other drug makers to aggressively market opioid painkillers. So this is bad. This is pervasive. This is a countrywide plan of deception, intention to hook. They don't care how many people die, how many people get addicted. This was all about money. And it took this long for their intentions to be laid bare. And there are still people who say there was no wrongdoing here.
Well, and you got to ask yourself too, Jen, that, where was the FDA in all this, you might ask?
Yeah.
There are government agencies that are made to protect us.
Yeah.
And you might be thinking, well, okay, again, this downstream approach. Oh, no, like Walmart's doing, let's sue all these things. Well, Curtis Wright worked for the FDA. He's the one who approved OxyContin and later worked for Purdue Pharma.
Yeah, it's
and
the thought starting in the hen house.
They show this... I think this is where you get very frustrated as an American and as a taxpayer, where you go, okay, my job is to manage myself.
Right.
I elect officials. I do believe in government. I do believe in democracy. I do believe in these things. And then you feel really fucking slighted.
Right.
When this is all, you're talking about policies, you're talking about acts.
Yeah.
How is the average American supposed to make sense of this?
Yeah, it's tough. And I think we saw a lot of this when the COVID vaccine came out.
Yeah.
And we saw vaccine hesitancy. And when you have the FDA and doctors and big companies that should know better or do know better and don't necessarily care because they're making money, and you see how insidious this is, it's not surprising that there's groups of people who say, I don't know if I trust this vaccine. I don't know if I trust the FDA. I don't know if I trust our government.
I understand that.
And it's hard for me, too, to say, yes, these things have happened and they continue to happen. But in this instance, you can trust. I get the reticence.
Yeah.
I do.
Especially for marginalized populations.
Exactly. Who have been actively experimented on in the past. I totally understand. But I do, by and large, believe that the COVID vaccine is safe. And I recommend we all get it.
I just got this feeling when I was watching Painkiller, and I watched a lot of the OxyContin stuff because I'm fascinated by it, but you just had this feeling that, like, is there a room full of rich white men that just run the world?
There is. Like, that's what the 1% is, dude.
Right? Like, you just feel, because again, it's like, here's these payouts. People died.
Yeah.
Young people died. People who thought, they had a knee injury and they listened to their doctor because we're taught to trust.
Yep.
And people died. We're talking about death here. We're talking about lives.
Yeah.
And that it makes me viscerally angry. And sorry, I'm looking at you, but I'm like,
I'm not taking it personally. I ain't describing anything.
But you know what I mean? I think there's just this, we've talked about this before, this like, I can't deal with the amount of ick that's out there.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to live my fucking life. And so I get why people kind of can't get into this, but we have to look at this really differently because this is how when we talk about recovery, and still we're talking about addiction.
Yeah.
This, and what Uzo Aduba actually does in the movie, she's like, I was thinking about this and looking at this opioid situation in Purdue, and I remembered where I experienced this. Mm-hmm. She's like, this is the same thing with the crack epidemic, except this character, although I believe this is I think I don't know if Edie Flowers, I'll look this up. The character she plays, she's like, my brother's in prison.
Yeah, that's right.
And Richard Sackler's at a party.
That's right. That's right.
That's not, there's this matter of fairness that's a huge thing for me.
It's an affront to our idea of justice and fairness.
There isn't.
And equity and equality.
I don't think there
doesn't exist. It doesn't. And it's the same thing. We talked about this in our marijuana episode. All of the white folks who are owning dispensaries and multi-million-dollar cannabis businesses, well, there are literally still people of color locked up for marijuana offenses.
It's not right and it's not fair. And when we know better, I think that's the thing. Once people make mistakes, shit happens. But then why does it take so long for it to get righted?
Well, systems are I don't want to say systems are broken. I think the systems are working the way that they are intended to work, which is in an inequitable and racist fashion. But it takes a lot to disrupt those systems.
Yes.
And if people are choosing to remain ignorant, and I'm not judging, because it could be to protect yourself, because God knows we have enough on our plates without taking these problems on and trying to take an in-depth dive into understanding all that's wrong.
Yeah.
But once you get a sense of, and you start to, it's all similar.
Yes.
Like all of these inequities are predicated on the same system, and many of them have the same trajectory and exploit the same members of our communities.
Yes.
So it's so tied in. So once you're aware of one, it's hard to kind of turn it off in relation to all of the other inequities that are being perpetuated and promoted by the people who are supposed to protect us. It is depressing.
But also use that anger, and I love when you say this, use that anger to advocate.
Absolutely.
Use that privilege to go out and do better.
Yeah. Totally.
Because you can.
You can. So, we're going to wrap it up. It's also fucking disgusting. And, with the opioid crisis in particular, you see a major pharmaceutical company literally pushing addiction just to line their pockets. There's so many fucked up factors at play here, from the war on drugs to racist sentencing policies. And we know we could spend hours talking about this, how we just had to cut ourselves off, which is exactly why we needed the second part. If there's one takeaway to be had here, it's question everything. Question what the media is framing as the truth. Question the government waging any sort of war on anything. And always follow the money. Yeah. Shit, I didn't even get to touch the prison industrial complex and the growth that industry has experienced due to the fucking drug sentencing policies that we've seen.
Yeah, it's basically slavery.
It is. 13th Amendment allows that to be the only form of slavery that we permit still. I promise that, we're going to talk about this some other time. But join us next week when we discuss the challenges associated with abstinence-only treatment, who has access to the best treatment, and the way our society treats addicts. And as always, a focus on trauma.
Yes.
So join us next week. And in the interim, make sure you subscribe, give us a good review. Check us out on TikTok and pray that we all recover from our various illnesses soon.
I'll try not to sneeze anymore in our recording.
It's disgusting.
It's disgusting.
All right, you guys, take care. Don't get sick. Bye.
I like that.